Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we are going to be diving quickly back into the old world, specifically because GW laid out how the shooting phase is going to work when Old World releases. And ladies and gentlemen, they did it. The shooting rules in Warhammer Old World are absolute garbage. And this is one of the things I said would sink them in the long run if this wasn't something they addressed and fixed. Because in past editions like 8th edition and 7th edition, the shooting rules were really bad. In 8th edition, they were slightly better than in 7th, but still not great in a lot of ways. And GW decided to not only resurrect those old rules for shooting, but it seems like, based on this article, that they made them a little bit worse. And to me, this is just such a deep shame. Truly. A shame that would dishonor the ancestors. It would dishonor Grungy. It would dishonor Valleya. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to go ahead and go over why this is such a shame. Because some of you might actually not know and not realize the significance of these announcements. You know, a lot of you are probably 40K players. Maybe you're thinking into getting into Old World for the first time, and you don't exactly know if you want to get into it or not. And then, of course, a lot of you are old Warhammer Fantasy players who are just itching to get back into the game and just want some well-written rules to play with, right? Because you guys remember, you old Longbeards, you remember how bad the rules were in 8th edition and in 7th edition. And I know that some of the things I'm saying, especially, you know, my commentary over Warhammer Fantasy has been a little bit salty in the past, and maybe some of you think that there's a little bit of bias there because, you know, I, for one, had a huge fantasy dwarf army. And, you know, when Warhammer Fantasy died and GW canned it, I ended up selling the army, you know, a couple years later after trying some different game systems and not really being able to get fully into it and fully invested. And yes, I do have a little bit of salt for GW for that, and that's one of the reasons why I'm personally not going to be investing in Warhammer Old World when it comes out. But I want to keep these opinions as strictly unbiased as possible. And I'm really going to try to provide an unbiased perspective for you guys and kind of talk about GW's reveal of the shooting phase in a very unbiased way, right? Because again, I was a dwarf player and, you know, dwarves love their shooting. And unfortunately, the shooting rules are just really bad this time around. Not just for dwarves, but for pretty much every faction in the game that likes to, you know, use shooting units. So, without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right into the video and talk about GW's new Warhammer Old World shooting phase. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be doing in today's video. We're going to be talking about the recent Warhammer community article discussing how shooting will work in Warhammer Old World and what this means for shooting units in Old World. And guys, it's not looking good. So right off the bat, GW in the beginning of the article basically introduces shooting as this really cool, awesome thing, right? And they're really hyping shooting up and you're thinking, oh my God, this is going to be great. You know, shooting's actually going to matter. It's going to make a difference in the battle. And you read the first two weapons that they present to you. And you have an artillery piece. It looks like the Screaming Skull Catapult, which was a, you know, Tomb King's unit, an artillery unit. And then you have the, you know, humble longbow, which is used by peasant archers in the Bretonnian army. So you're looking at the stats and you're looking at the longbow, and range 30, pretty good, right? The longbow had range 30 before, strength 3, which makes sense. It's, you know, kind of a light bow. It's wielded by peasants, so it's not going to be that strong. AP nothing. It has armor bane 1 and volley fire. So I'm assuming armor bane means, you know, -1 armor, just kind of like -1 AP. And then volley fire comes out. And for some of you, that may not mean a lot. But to me, this screamed bad right away because volley fire was a rule that used to allow multiple ranks of range units to be able to shoot, meaning you could only shoot one rank normally in the past. Now, when I saw that, I was really hoping that it meant something else this time around, right? Like maybe volley fire means you can shoot over terrain or something like that. And please, by Grungy, let this be the case. However, I looked to artillery, And artillery looks pretty good, right? The Screaming Skull Catapult has the bombardment rule. I'm curious on, how that works. I'm assuming there's some sort of scatter mechanic or scatter dice that you have to roll for it, which is like what it was before. And this kind of makes sense as well. This is not something I'm mad at. Typically, artillery pieces were like this. You would declare a target, you'd put a marker down where you declared your target, and you'd roll some sort of scatter dice or, bounce dice or something like that. And this was, in my opinion, both fun and fairly reliable. Unless you rolled really bad on your artillery dice, you were going to probably get something. With a cannon, if you're firing through a unit of guys, you may, clip 2 models, and that's considered a bad roll. But on a good roll, you'd probably get the whole, 5 ranks or whatever you were shooting at. Or if you were firing a big monster or something, you would definitely hit that model, at least. So the Screaming Skull Catapult actually looks pretty good. It has 2 strength values, 1 for the blast and 1 for the center of the blast. There is going to be blast markers in Warhammer Fantasy, it looks like. So it is a template weapon. You have a small blast. It's about 3 inches. And you center that over a formation. And then you roll scatter dice to, see where it goes from there. It does have the cumbersome rule. And it does have move and shoot. So I assume that means it's going to be unable to shoot in the same turn it moves, which makes sense. It also has flaming and magical attacks, as well as multiple wounds D3+1 for the center of the blast, and it has something called Screaming Skulls. So the Screaming Skull Catapult, this is pretty close to what it once was. It was a pretty cool artillery piece for the Tomb Kings, and it remains so. I have no issue with this. It looks pretty cool. And of course, like all artillery pieces, it does have a minimum range because, as you guys know, realistically, historically, you can't fire an artillery piece at something that is too close to you. So I'm looking at those, weapon stats, and I'm thinking, oh God, hopefully volley fire isn't what I think it is. And yep, it is. In the next paragraph, they say, only the front rank, unless they have volley fire, can shoot. So shooting units like handgunners, quarrelers, thunderers, crossbowmen from the Empire, basically anything without a regular bow. If you have a crossbow, if you have a handgun, if you're shooting javelins or blow darts or whatever it is, if it doesn't have volley fire, you can only shoot in 1 rank, which is quite awful. On average, thunderers would hit on a 5+ at long range, meaning only a couple of hits and maybe 1 wound if you can only fire in 1 rank. Which is just awful. And if you think about it, you're spending a lot of extra points for these ranged weapons. And yes, inevitably they will be more points than melee units because they have a ranged weapon. You're spending a lot more points on these units, and they're not doing anything for you. And this was the problem in previous editions. You would spend a bunch of points to give your guys handguns or to give your guys crossbows or whatever over regular melee troops. And they would end up killing only like 1 model of volley because, again, you could only shoot in 1 rank. Now, this is actually worse than what it was in 8th edition because in 8th edition, GW said, you know what, shooting units aren't good enough. We're going to give them an extra rank to shoot in. They can shoot in 2 ranks. And if you think about it, this makes more realistic sense as well, as a ranged unit that is firing handguns or firing crossbows would be trained to shoot in multiple ranks. So the fact that units can only shoot in 1 rank is a little bit suspect and not only not realistic, and again, this isn't a realistic game, I understand that, it's a fantasy game, but, if you're going to have historically realistic kind of models that are firing weapons that exist in the real world, you would expect them to at least act like weapons in the real world and act like units that are firing those weapons to be as efficient as possible, right? So this is a little bit of a bummer that units can only fire in 1 rank, and quite frankly, really disappointing. Now, if that wasn't enough, not only can you only shoot in 1 rank normally, but rolling to hit is based on a unit's ballistic skill, and units with a really high ballistic skill get rerolls. Now, I'm not necessarily against this system. It does seem a bit needlessly complicated for higher ballistic skill units, really high-powered units, probably Wood Elves, let's be real here. Wood Elves are probably the only faction, and High Elves maybe, that are going to benefit from this. I really don't see any other factions, anything really coming close. But yeah, the higher your ballistic skill is, the better chance of to hit you have. And, if it's 6 or over, you get a reroll, you get to hit on a 2+, and if you miss that for whatever reason, if you have a 6 ballistic skill, you get a 6+ chance to actually make that hit. So again, is it that great of a chance? No. If you roll that 1, you're probably not going to get the second roll, but it does help a little bit. And I really think that this is just a callback to the nostalgia of older editions. This isn't really an efficient way to actually write rules, right? Because it's overly complicated and stuff like that. But again, I don't have much of an issue with this. It's kind of a non-issue for me, at least this part of the rule, but it does make it needlessly complicated for no reason. Also, the old wound chart is back, and that means that certain strength values cannot harm a really high toughness value. So in 40k, we're used to any weapon being able to wound any toughness on a 6, no matter what the difference is. But in Warhammer Fantasy, it seems like there's certain weapons that just won't be able to do it. For example, Strength 3 bows will never be able to wound a Toughness 9 creature. Now, there are not many of these in the game. The only, kind of creatures like that in the game are going to be things like Nurgle beasts, huge greater demons, steam tanks, you're just absolutely massive units on the battlefield. Those are the only things that are really going to be Toughness 9 anyway, so you won't really have to worry about that too much. But, creatures like that do exist for some armies. Not really a big deal, but it will suck if your unit of archers can't even scratch something, like a greater demon of Nurgle or something like that. Now, here's really where I kind of had another problem with shooting in Warhammer Fantasy, at least, the prior editions, 8th edition, 7th edition, and so forth, is that there were so many negative modifiers to shooting that shooting units that were of average ballistic skill or even good ballistic skill would be reduced to pretty much garbage within, most of the game turns that you were playing in. So here's the thing also, is that negative modifiers in Warhammer Fantasy stack. So if you're firing at something over half your weapon's range, like take that longbow, for example, we talked about earlier, if you're firing at any target over 15 inches, you are at -1 to hit. On top of that, if the unit is behind a fence or something like that, some sort of light cover, it's another -1 to hit. If your opponent is charging you, that's an additional -1 to hit. And there's other factors involved as well. There's different spells, obviously, that will give you a -1 to hit and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different negative modifiers that can, kind of really affect your ability to shoot. And if for whatever reason you go over 6+, so for example, if I have a unit of peasant bowmen who normally need to hit on a 5+ because they're peasants, they're horrible at shooting, which makes sense, right? And I'm firing at something at long range, they hit on a 6+. But if that unit is also in partial cover, I'm going to hit on a 7+. So that means I need a 6 followed by another roll of a 4+ in order to hit. And I really am struggling to find the reason for this. Like, what is the reason for actually introducing this to the game? Is there any? It makes shooting units really bad, but not only that, it's just needlessly complicated. Like, maybe I would have gotten 1 hit beforehand. And now that 1 hit is maybe not even going to hit because the unit's in partial cover. So my question is, what is the point of actually putting that in there? Why not just give the unit the hit? Why make it so needlessly hard for shooting units to actually kill enemy models? Right? It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me to have a system that is so oppressive to shooting when shooting is not really that strong to begin with in this game. Like, really, shooting is not a huge part of the game. Why make it so needlessly oppressive to shooting units? I just don't understand the logic in that. And, it's, again, I know I keep saying this, but it's a damn shame that GW went this direction with shooting. And then it kind of gets worse because you realize something that GW said they were going to fix is now back, which is panic tests. Now, hopefully, they didn't go into what a panic test is, but hopefully, I'm praying to Grungy here, that panic tests don't cause the unit to just straight up and fall back off the table. In the past, if you failed a panic check, you had to fall back, which would often lead your units, especially in the first couple turns of the game, to run off the table and die. And this really sucks because those units are usually pretty big and pretty, sometimes filled with characters and stuff like that. So you could end up losing like 500 points in the first turn of the game if you fail something like this. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Now, as a dwarf player, this didn't happen a lot to me because dwarves had really good leadership and they had a lot of rerolls and stuff like that, but occasionally it did, but it was really rare. Now, for those other armies out there that are lower leadership, and if you're going against another player who has maybe a good amount of magic in their army, or they have a good amount of artillery in the army that's, going to be able to deal 25% casualties to one of your units, if you have to take a panic check in the first turn of the game and you lose your entire unit right off the bat, that's going to be a really bad experience for you. It's going to leave a really bad taste in your mouth. And again, I'm really hoping that they do panic tests right and actually do what they promised, which was work on the leadership mechanics so that they're not so oppressive, right? That they're not so swingy. So hopefully a panic check is just like, maybe if you fail it, you can't march in the next turn or something like that. Or, you have to move at half speed because your unit's a little bit bewildered or whatever. I'm really hoping it's something like that and not something that can cause an absolute rout fest where your whole army pretty much routs in one turn of the game. Now, I know some of you have said you kind of liked that about Warhammer Fantasy, which was, that was crazy to me because I was thinking to myself, as someone who played dwarves, I hated the fact that my dwarves would sometimes fall back and I had really high leadership in my army. And I actually knew an Orcs and Goblins player who had a Night Goblin army. Now, this is absolutely true. He had a Night Goblin army. He brought it to a tournament. The first turn he played, an opponent cast a spell on one of his goblin units. He took a panic check, and every single goblin unit in his army, which I think they were like leadership 5 or something like that, failed their leadership check, failed their panic tests, and fell off the board. He got tabled because somebody shot a magic missile at one of his units that ended up killing 25% of his unit. Now, that is kind of funny in hindsight, but to be real with you guys, it's not good game design. And even though you may enjoy it, that doesn't make it a good move on the designers of the game's part, right? It's something that needed to be fixed before. Now, again, we don't know for sure this is how panic tests work, but GW is plugging in a lot of old rules from 7th and 8th edition in verbatim into Old World. So I think this is, a little bit of a cause for concern, which I hope they address pretty soon. Now, they did also go over magic missiles, which I found a little bit refreshing. Now, we don't exactly know how wizards cast magic yet. I hope they go over this in a future commentary. But based on my reading, it seems like magic is pretty reasonable. But then again, these are obviously the easier spells to cast, right? Fireball and Vortex of Chaos, these are the lower end spells. These are probably the spells that just a lot of wizards come with base. These aren't the more advanced spells that wizards have access to. However, even so, they are still miles better than the non-artillery shooting. Vortex of Chaos, for example, while not doing a ton of damage, thank Grungy for that they fixed the damage aspect of Vortex spells at first glance. Now, that may not be the case for the full rules, there might be Vortexes that are much more powerful than that, who knows? But it looks like they kind of fixed the damage on some of these spells. It does, however, seem really disruptive for such an easy spell to cast. Basically forcing the unit to move as if in dangerous terrain, and also, moving every turn if you don't dispel it, it seems pretty disruptive. And again, it's on an 8+, but we don't know whether, the wizard is rolling 2 dice and adding his power level to the roll or what exactly that means. So we don't know how easy these spells are to cast yet. But hopefully we have some effective anti-magic and dispelling tools as well. So, we can only hope, but I hope this is a part of the game that, casting something like Fireball isn't so easily spammed. You can't just have, 3 or 4 level 1 wizards casting Fireball, and it's a really easy spell to cast, and it ends up doing a lot of damage. Because if you think about it, 2d6, strength 4 hits, it doesn't sound great, but these are auto hits. These aren't something you have to roll for. These are just, 2d6 straight up hits. Your opponent, you roll to wound obviously is normal, but then your opponent makes armor saves. Armor isn't the greatest in this game. Most units with heavy armor and shield are capping out at 4+, unless they have some sort of better armor, like a Grommeal armor, like the Ironbreakers, or, Chaos Warrior armor, for example, which you'll end up seeing a 3+ for. But, even if that's the case, 2d6 strength 4 hits, used 3 or 4 times throughout your army is significant. Now, the last thing the article covers is they look at some of the different shooting rules. They go over a couple of, different types of weapons, breath weapons, fire and flee, which, they say some skirmish cav can fire and flee. This was like, pistoliers could shoot and then move, stuff like that, Instead of, moving and then shooting, they could shoot and then move. That's basically what fire and flee was. Although I believe they called it something else back then, but I'm not 100% sure. Because I didn't really play Empire a lot, but I played against them quite frequently. I just can't remember exactly what it was called. Breath weapons are basically a flame template. And quick shot is something that they say Dwarven Iron Drakes have. They have the Cinder Drake bombs or Cinder Blast bombs. Now, quick shot is probably something that just allows you to move and shoot or stand and shoot when you're getting charged without the hit modifier. And I guarantee you this is something that probably every grenade unit is going to have, Skaven Globadiers or Death Globe Bombardiers or, Poison Wind Globadiers, whatever they are. They're going to have something like that, and it's going to be the same thing. So basically, because the weapon's range is so low, they don't suffer the hit penalty for moving and shooting or standing and shoot. So it seems really good, and they make it seem really awesome. But remember, it's a ranged weapon. You can still only shoot with the first rank. So it's only going to be 5 dwarfs or, 5 iron drakes that are going to be firing those things. They're going to be hitting on 4+ most likely, unless your opponent has some other modifier that's going to modify you further. And 9 times out of 10, it's only going to end up killing 1 or 2 models. Unless you get lucky, which, is always a possibility. All right, so what does this mean for shooting units in the old world? Now, I said before it's not good, and I think by now you probably get the gist that shooting units in general, at least your basic shooting units, your rank and file shooting units, are not going to be good in this game. They're going to have a really tough time being able to shoot, and when they are able to, it will be extremely ineffective. And let me just do some quick math hammer for you guys. A full unit of 30 peasant bowmen with longbows will only hit 5 times at long range and only wound twice. And most likely, your opponent is going to have heavy armor and they're going to have a shield. Most likely. Which means you're only going to kill one of them. And, even if you do have something like Armor Bane where you're getting -1 armor, I mean, maybe they do fail both. If you do kill 2 models, that's kind of good, I guess. But you're realistically only going to get, 2 opportunities to shoot with your unit before your opponent closes into combat with you, which doesn't really give you a great chance to deal a lot of damage. And also, units without volley fire are pretty much worthless in bigger units, as most of them can't even shoot. So what's the point of taking 20 Dwarf Thunderers when only the first rank can fire? Right? You might as well just use 10 and just put them in a rank of 10. 1 long rank, which, again, limits you in a lot of ways. You're going to be way less effective in combat. It's going to be really hard to maneuver you across the battlefield. You're basically going to insta-break when something charges into you, and it's just not going to be a good time in general. And that's assuming that they allow, gun units and crossbow units to move and shoot. Because in previous editions, like in 7th edition, for example, guns and crossbows could not move and fire. You had to stand still, and you could only fire in a 90-degree arc. So that meant that, basically where you deployed is where you sat the entire game because you never wanted to lose a turn of shooting. And basically you just didn't take shooting units back then either because they were really, really bad. And it seems like they're going to be really, really bad in Old World. Shooting units will also be inevitably more expensive than their combat counterparts while also being a lot worse in melee, and there's no substantial upside as we saw with the peasants. So, peasant bowmen versus, men-at-arms or something like that. What's the difference? Well, the difference is, even though the peasant bowman will kill about 3 models before your opponent closes into combat with you, the men-at-arms are going to be able to hold the enemy longer in place because of their shields. They have better armor usually, probably light armor or something like that, while bowmen might not have any armor at all. And the spears are going to allow them to attack in, multiple ranks in combat. So they're going to be more competent in combat, and they're going to end up making up for that damage within a couple of rounds if they can actually hold. And typically you're going to want your units to hold for longer, especially as Bretonnia, so that your Bretonnia Knights can come in and, around the flank or come in for those juicy rear charges and things like that to break up enemy units and run them down. So there's not much room for peasant bowmen within a Bretonnian army, even though they're like iconic, right? They're one of the iconic Bretonnian units, the Bretonnian peasant archers, right? And all of you guys know them from, Warhammer Total War and stuff like that. And let me tell you, and another thing is that, a lot of players are going to be coming from Warhammer Total War. So they're going to be kind of expecting shooting units to be a little bit more effective. And when they find out their unit of peasant bowmen can only kill one enemy model a turn, it's going to be a real bummer, because peasant bowmen were one of the cooler units in the Bretonnian army in Warhammer Total War. And, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating that the peasant bowmen on the tabletop should be as good as the ones in the game, because, let's be real, the ones in the game were like a really meta unit and stuff like that. They were really very powerful and stuff. So you're probably not going to see that. But I would have at least liked to see, ranged units actually contribute to the battle in a meaningful way. And, how the rules are written now, how shooting works, there's just no possible chance that they can. So in conclusion, it looks like GW didn't pick up the hint that regular ranked range units were completely worthless in previous editions and chose not to fix the bad shooting mechanics that they had before. And even with more tame magic, there seems to be no reason to take ranged infantry over either wizards or artillery in Warhammer Old World. So one of the things I do like, by the way, just to end this video on kind of a positive note, is that the artillery doesn't look bad. It doesn't look like they nerfed artillery to the ground or anything like that. It does look pretty solid. For those of you who like artillery, like cannons or organ guns or, Hellblaster volley guns, you're still probably going to be able to get some good use out of those models. They're still, looking good. But, your kind of regular rank and file infantry, your handgunners, your crossbowmen, your archers aren't going to be good in the game. And they're just going to be very lackluster. Not only that, they're really not going to play a significant role in any battle. But, even though GW took the big fat L on this one, on the shooting phase, hopefully the other phases of the game are better. And, overall, Warhammer Old World will still be a good experience for those of you who want to play it. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have helped me over the last year in supporting the channel. I really do appreciate it. And, if you do want to help support the channel and join our channel Patreon, I have free trials activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community who loves to talk about Eldar strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel on my channel store page to rep your local game store, or you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon through any of my affiliate links, I will leave the links for those in the description as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Thanks for watching, and peace out. I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.